All right. Come over here and make that maximum. Okay, this is our 7th lesson, chapter 3, part 2. We have a little bit of this material in chapter 3, so I'll link it with chapter 3. But I'm adding some arguments and logical fallacies that atheists make or commit. So we'll be dealing with those as we go through this in some more detail. Last week, we were looking at the Hittites and showing the arguments that had been made by certain people about the Hittites. The first fallacy we're going to look at is what's called deductive fallacy. Now, there's two kinds of reasoning, inductive and deductive. And inductive, you take a series of observations, look at them, you don't look at everything. And so you draw a conclusion. You look at polar bears, for example. I look at polar bears, and every polar bear I see is white. I look at several thousand polar bears, they're all white. So I conclude that probably all polar bears are what? Well, they're white. But I could undo that conclusion by finding a brown or black polar bear, couldn't I? That would undo that conclusion. That would falsify it. But if you looked at all the polar bears in the world and they were all white, then that would be reasoning deductively from it. If I say all the polar bears are white, then I say this is a polar bear. Well, it's got to be white then. That would be deductive reasoning. One of the fallacies that we were looking at last week is denying the antecedent. Now, antecedent is right here. Antecedent, ante, A-N-T-E, is Latin for before. And so antecedent, it goes before. Skeptics, and I include atheists and agnostics, I think there's some people that claim to believe in God that are skeptical about the Bible. They claim to believe in God, but they think the Bible has errors in it, which is ludicrous to me. If the Bible has errors in it, then you can't believe the Bible. And of course, I don't believe it has any errors. Several arguments of skeptics will be set forth that deny the antecedent. They commit this logical fallacy. In fact, over the years, I've classified the arguments made by atheists, and I'm satisfied that every single one of them has a fallacy in it, logical fallacy. And I think if you start looking at them very carefully and look at logic, you'll find that atheism is irrational. So is agnosticism. They're irrational. And so we're going to consider one common fallacy and pick up a couple more, I think. A fallacy is any argument that seems conclusive to the normal mind when you first look at it, but proves, if you examine it more closely, that it has a flaw in the reasoning. And so it doesn't draw or reach the conclusion that they're claiming to establish it. In 1853, a man named Newman, this man, I believe, was a Roman Catholic, one of the clergymen of the Roman Catholic Church. And remember, the Roman Catholics will tell you they believe the Bible, but then if you talk to them carefully, they'll say it has errors in it. Okay. What errors? Well, any error that would falsify Roman Catholic doctrine. Any verse that would falsify Roman Catholic doctrine is in error. Newman wrote, if the Hittites existed at all, say, in 1853, if they existed at all, no Hittite king could have compared the power to the king of Judah. So they were a weak kingdom, and if they existed at all. So he's saying they didn't even exist. This is Francis William Newman, a history of the Hebrew monarchy from the administration of Samuel to the Babylonian captivity. And this is the book it's cited from, 1853. Any questions? Newman was a skeptic. I think there's two kinds of atheists. Explicit atheist, that's the guy that just brags and said, I'm an atheist. And an implicit atheist is somebody who would take draw a conclusion, and he would make a claim that if it were true, God cannot exist. He's an implicit atheist. And I think Newman was an implicit atheist, but we won't get into that in more great detail. In simplified terms, Newman's argument was the Bible mentions the Hittites, and we have not found evidence outside the Bible that the Hittites existed. Therefore, the Bible must be in error. It's errant. Okay? It's the only source that mentions the Hittites. And so we haven't found any evidence they exist. Therefore, they didn't exist. Right? Newman's argument in more formal terms is on the next slide here. If we have discovered evidence of the Hittite Empire outside the Bible, then the Hittite Empire existed. Well, this is true. Everyone, we have to agree with that. If you found evidence, then it did exist. That's certainly true. And he said at that time in 1853, we have not discovered evidence of the Hittite Empire outside the Bible. At that time, that was true. We haven't found evidence outside the Bible. That's certainly true. Both of these premises are true, or they were true in 1853. Conclusion is the Hittite Empire did not exist. Well, I want you to look at his basic argument here. This is one general argument against the inerrancy of scriptures of that time. So what's your antecedent? Your antecedent, click on this, I'll just draw my cursor across it. You can follow it here. This part right here down to here and right here. We have discovered evidence of the Hittite Empire outside the Bible. That's your antecedent. A-N-T-E, not A-N-T-I. A-N-T-I is Greek, A-N-T-E is Latin. So that's the first part. That's what goes before. And so when you deny that antecedent, it doesn't necessarily disprove your conclusion. Okay? All right? And both these premises are true. This first premise and this second premise are both true. But the structure of the argument doesn't prove a cotton picking thing. If you deny the antecedent, that doesn't necessarily disprove the conclusion. Okay? And so the argument contains a simple fallacy. You take a good logic course in college, one of the first things they'll teach you about the fallacy of denying the antecedent. And the first course, you're going to study that logical fallacy. It's a simple fallacy. It's a very common fallacy. This is the fallacy this fellow committed. Well, I suspect there's a lot of people who say, oh, the Bible has errors in it. Look at this. We can't find the Hittites. Well, lo and behold, what happened? It never existed. That's his claim, but the archaeologists have found it. The Bible mentions the Hittites or the Hittite or Hittite, singular, plural. Hittite, singular, is found 37 verses in the Bible and 10 verses with the word Hittites, plural. So that's 47 verses have the word Hittites. Now, the word may be duplicated in some of the verses, but so we could say there's 37 verses and 10, some of them may be some overlap between these. So there's close to 47 verses with the word Hittite or Hittites in them. So it's mentioned more than once. It's not just a passing thing. Clearly, the conclusion of the skeptics was proven to be false for archaeological evidence. We're going to show the evidence for it now. Right here is the region of the Hittite Empire. Here is your Hittite Empire. Here's the city of Troy. They think Troy was here. They're not totally sure about Troy, but they're pretty sure it was right up here. And right here is the Hittite Empire at one time. And here's the Egyptian Empire ruled up through here. And there's your Hittite. And so the Hittite Empire was a pretty large empire at one time. This is under Ramses II, the Egyptian Empire. So they fought one another. They had battles out in here. That's been documented now. They fought each other. The two empires did. There's from some of their ruins that they discovered. That's a carving, a relief carving. And so they've carved out of the rock, they've carved the picture of someone depicting some of their kings, rulers. The maximum extent of the empire, 1350 to 1322. This information is ironclad. They don't even, none of the archaeologists disagree with this. I think it's the maximum extent of the empire. Pretty good sized empire. It includes most of what we now know as the nation of Turkey. And so, right here. But you see, this was a very convincing argument in 1853 if you reason improperly. If you reason improperly, you can say, well, we don't have any evidence of them, but now they've found evidence all over the place that this empire existed. They've even deciphered some of their writings. All right. And here they are in 1300 BC. They had shrunk a little bit, but in 1300 BC, that's where they were. The dark red is the old kingdom. Here's the old kingdom, which had spread out in 1300 BC. Here's some of their pictures of their chariots, okay? This is their chariots. And Alexander the Great, after him, nobody ever used chariots after that, but that's a long story. He figured out how to stop chariots, okay? Here's the Anatolia. And so right here's part of their empire, this another time of the Hittite Empire, 1350 to 1300 BC. This would be pretty close, getting pretty close to the time of King David, isn't it? Pretty close to that time. A little bit before, but it's getting close to it, to the time of that. Here's some pictures of them, and it's on their tombs and other stuff. And of course, they're putting grapes in there. It looks like grapes. I think it's grapes. But they're making an offering, probably to some god, some false god, of course, not the true God. Here's their city gates flanked by lions. And of course, they're old. They've been around nearly 3,000 years, so they've deteriorated a bit. But you can see their city gates flanked. Here's a treaty of Kadesh. And they had a treaty. I think this treaty is with the Egyptians. They finally had stopped some of their warfare. Okay. Here's one of their relief carvings on one of their buildings, a Hittite relief. And so it looks like a lion or some kind of a big cat with wings on it. And then a man too. Kind of crazy looking stuff, but they have some wild ideas about stuff. All right, here's one of their gods, Tarhunt, Teshud. And so they found that god that they worshipped, almost like the Apis bull the Egyptians worshipped, didn't it? All right. So, and here's the walk of the gods and a relief carving that we can show here. Again, there's evidence, abundant evidence they existed. So 1853, may have convinced some irrational people, but the argument itself was flawed. Why? Because it didn't prove it. Absence of evidence doesn't prove evidence of absence. Okay? The argument of the skeptics, atheists, was obviously wrong. Well, why? Well, because it's logically invalid. It denied the antecedent. So it doesn't prove anything. And it was shown to be fallacious later on, but anybody that studied logic could see it was fallacious to begin with. So we need to have our young people to understand how to reason. This scares me to no end because people don't know how to reason anymore. And because they don't know how to reason, we have trouble. We have all kinds of flawed reasoning going on. The argument was invalid because it contained a logical fallacy, the fallacy of denying the antecedent. Are there questions or comments? Now, of course, the evidence, the first premise was shown that they did find. So if they hadn't found any, but you see, they have found it. Okay. But an example of denying the antecedent, just to illustrate it so we can kind of see what it looks like. If Joe is a citizen of Texas and it says the United States, well, that's true, because every citizen of Texas is also a citizen of the United States. That's a true statement. Joe is not a citizen of Texas, all right? I know some Joes. In fact, the very congregation where I serve as an elder has a member whose name is Joe. and he's a citizen of Oklahoma. He's not a citizen of Texas. So we can argue then that this Joe that attends as a member where I serve as an elder, he's not a citizen of the United States. Well, that's foolish. He is a citizen of the United States. So you say there's got to be something wrong with the reasoning. If Joe is a citizen of Texas, yes, that's true. He's a citizen of the United States. The Joe of which I speak is not a citizen of Texas. That's true. Well, I can't conclude he's not a citizen of the United States because he's a citizen of Oklahoma. And that makes him a citizen of the United States. What's wrong? Well, the antecedent has been denied. And so what we have is we have a conclusion that cannot be established. It may or may not be true that Joe is a citizen of the United States, but it's sure not proven by this argument. This argument proves nothing. Everyone see what I'm talking about? Are there any questions? So right here now, Joe is a citizen of Texas. Yes, if he is, he's a citizen of the United States. But there are other ways to become a citizen of the United States other than being a citizen of Texas. Now, any questions? There's other ways it could be established other than that. Citizen of Texas is in this right in here. And there's a citizen of the United States. Joe that's right here, he's a citizen of the United States, but the Joe that's out here, like Joe said in Oklahoma, he's still a citizen of the United States. And most everybody in this class is citizen of the United States. And you probably, if you're from another state, like Colorado or somewhere else, you probably, or Missouri, you probably know someone named Joe. It's a pretty common name. And so if you know someone named Joe, that's a citizen of, say, Colorado or Missouri or some other state, not Texas, he's still a citizen of the United States. Any questions there? So there's something flawed in the reasoning, isn't there? Yeah, there is. And it's a logical fallacy. It doesn't prove it. Could be a citizen of Utah, Iowa, or some other state and still be a citizen of the United States. Doesn't have to be a citizen of Texas. Right? Here's the second example of that argument. If archaeologists have found the city of Ai, now that's the city the children of Israel went to after the walls of Jericho fell and they took Jericho. Then the city of Ai existed. The mistake here, and I have a sermon that I preached on the mistakes of men of the Bible, men and women of the Bible. I have a series of sermons. Joshua was a great man, but he made several mistakes. The first mistake he made right here was he went to the city of Ai without consulting God about what to do. And when he did, because they had sinned, Achan had sinned, they didn't take the city of Ai. And so they had to go back and repent and take care of their problems first. If he'd have asked the Lord and prayed the Lord, said, what do we do next with this next city? God would have told him that you got sin in the camp. You can't do anything until you clean that up. But you see, he didn't consult God. And there's 2 or 3 times he didn't consult God. Same thing happened with David. Every time David got in trouble, if you look in the context, he did it on his own. He was deciding himself what to do rather than praying to God and asking God what to do. And the lesson for us is we go to the scriptures and ask God what to do in the scriptures. Any questions or comments? All right, let's go back to my point here now. I digressed a bit. If they found the city of Ai that existed, that's true. I don't think anyone could deny that. Suppose the archaeologists have not found the city of Ai. All right. And the conclusion is, therefore, it didn't exist. Well, that's not necessarily true. Have they looked everywhere? Well, that's a good question, see. And, of course, it denies the antecedent. Your antecedent is archaeologists have found the city of Ai. All right. And you deny that antecedent. You're denying, say they haven't found it. Well, again, the conclusion is not proven. It's a logical fallacy. How many times, if you put in logical form, you can look at the arguments of atheists and see they're just flawed to the core. It just amazes me. The fallacy was committed by Joseph A. Calloway in in the Biblical Archaeology Review, November, December 1988, page 24. All right. So Callaway died in 1988. I guarantee you, he's not an atheist anymore. I believe him. 5 seconds after you die, you cease to be an atheist. But Callaway was at least an implicit atheist. But he's arguing based upon a fallacious argument. Now, any questions? Now, why is it possible they haven't found the city of Ai? Well, first of all, I would say they probably haven't looked in the right place. But is it possible the city was destroyed and it was all wooden, and maybe maybe a flash flood washed it away, or maybe it just blew away, and if the wind blew the sand? I think they probably haven't looked in the right place, but you don't necessarily have the information there. There's archaeological evidence deals with pottery and other stuff. Some things like wood can be burned up. The city was burnt with fire by the children of Israel. Let's look at the next argument we have here. Here's another argument made, and I'll cite you where it's found. If archaeologists have dated the destruction of the city of Jericho at about 1400 BC, then the city of Jericho was destroyed in about 1400 BC. Now let me tell you this. I take the Exodus to be about 1446 or somewhere thereabouts BC. All right. I think I put it in the book here around 1500 BC, but I think it's closer to about 1450 BC. I think I put 1450 BC is what I put in the book here, but I'm going to probably go down to, I think it's about 1445 or 1446 BC. That would be the Exodus. And so 40 years later, Jericho was destroyed. Remember, they wandered 40 years in the wilderness. So I would argue about 1400 BC, and that's pretty close, within 5 or 10 years. Then the city of Jericho was destroyed at about that time. If we have archaeological evidence of it, then that would prove it. Well, that doesn't necessarily, the absence of archaeological evidence doesn't necessarily disprove it. The archaeologists have not dated the destruction of the city of Jericho at about 1400 BC. Why? Well, they look at their pottery, and they've got other dating methods that they've used. Okay, so whenever they look at it, some of their dating methods, I believe, have flaws in them. But so the city of Jericho was not destroyed in about 1400 BC. Again, you're arguing based upon the methods of dating things by the archaeologists. And how is their dating correct? All right, so that's a good question. All right. Galloway made this argument, and here again, Biblical Archaeology Review. Now, all right, any questions? Again, it denies the antecedent. And here's the source where he denied it. This was in the same article that I cited earlier. He made 2 basic arguments. Now, here's a generic argument that you'll see made by atheists and skeptics in general. If Christian John Doe, just made up name, can answer argument X, any arguments made by the atheist, by an atheist, then the argument X made by the atheist has an answer. Well, that's certainly true. If I can answer an argument you make, then there's an answer to it because I gave one. But just the fact that I cannot answer argument X made by an atheist doesn't prove anything, except that I can't answer the argument. That's all it proves. So if we deny the antecedent here, we haven't proven that there's no answer to it. We've just proven that John Doe can't answer it, or at least he can't answer it at that point. He may think of an answer later. So the fact that some Christian cannot give an answer doesn't mean there's not an answer. And I wonder how many young people go off to universities and they're fed this kind of argument. Some slick professor makes an argument and the student can't answer it. And then the student says reasons, well, I can't answer. It must not be an answer. Well, that's foolish reasoning. And it denies the antecedent too. Any comments or questions there? I mean, you can get off like this. A young person can go off to college and be even taught by people. The most dangerous people are the ones that he thinks are Christians that have messed up, that are messed up, because he trusts them and he's not on his guard against them. If it's an atheist and he knows an atheist, he's tend to be on his guard. So really, I think the most dangerous group are those who we think are Christians. They can be very dangerous. Are there any questions there? Comments? Our fifth example, and this one is made, and I'll cite this. This was made in Canada, in a site in Canada, in a newspaper in Canada. I'll give you the site in a minute. And the argument is, if there's archaeological evidence of several million Israelites who both camped and died in the wilderness during the 40 years of wilderness wanderings, then the 40 years of wilderness wanderings occurred. Well, that would be true. Who could deny that premise? Well, if there's archaeological evidence, then it happened. Well, that's true. Argument. There's no archaeological evidence of several million Israelites who both camped and died in the wilderness during the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. We don't have any archaeological evidence of it. Well, maybe there is, maybe there's not. But again, that doesn't prove a thing because it denies the antecedent. 40 years of wilderness wanderings did not occur. That's his conclusion. Again, this argument was made, and here's where it was made. The Israeli archaeologist, most of your Jews today are basically atheists. All right? Eliezer Oren searched for 10 years and failed to find a single shred of evidence that the biblical account of the Exodus from Egypt ever happened. And this is, of course, in the News Toronto Bureau, February 27, 1988. I took it right out of that source. There's no evidence to the back Exodus story. All right? But you see, the whole argument is flawed because it contains a logical fallacy. We haven't found it, therefore it didn't exist. We've already shown that happened with Newman on the Hittites. They finally found the evidence. In the city of Ai, they're making that same argument. And again, that's based upon a flawed reasoning. This argument has an additional problem. I'm convinced that Mount Sinai is not in what we call the Sinai Peninsula. That it's located on the east side of the Gulf of Aqaba, that it's not located on the west side of the Gulf of Aqaba, which traditionally Mount Sinai is supposed to be there. Now, let me point this out. The New Testament identifies where Mount Sinai is. It's in Arabia. And Arabia was never, what we call the Sinai Peninsula today, was never part of Arabia. It's in Arabia. And I'm convinced that Mount Sinai is in what we call, what is now the Saudi Arabia. It's in Arabia. And the west side of the Gulf of Aqaba. The Gulf of Aqaba is the only place that is explicitly called the Red Sea. Ezion Geber is on the Red Sea according to the scriptures. And that's at the north end of the Gulf of Aqaba. Nowhere does the Bible ever call that body of water that we call the Red Sea now, nowhere does the Bible ever call that the Red Sea. It's not called that in the Bible or other sources that I can find. But that's a different thing. He looked in the wrong place. He was not looking in what we call Saudi Arabia today. He was looking over in what is part of Egypt. And the Sinai Peninsula, what's called the Sinai Peninsula, incorrectly named, that name was given to it about 500 years after Christ by some queen. Some queen gave it that name. Some woman gave it that name. That's my study, it shows. All right. This argument has another problem. All right. Besides the fallacy of denying the antecedent, second fallacy problem is they looked in the wrong place. The third problem is they forgot to read the Bible carefully. And let's read Deuteronomy 29:5. And I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes are not waxed old upon you, and thy shoe is not waxed old upon thy foot. What does that tell you? That tells me that their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out. Well, now, wait a second. You're not going to find any shoes, any clothes thrown away because they didn't wear out. They didn't need to have potter's wheels to make pottery. I would argue that there's a good chance their pottery didn't break. And so they didn't have to make new pottery. They didn't have to make new clothing because it didn't wear out. Now, some people like to have new clothes from time to time, but theirs didn't wear out. Their shoes didn't wear out. That tells me something very interesting. Now, what happened to them in the wilderness? Well, you're not going to find a lot of your archaeological evidence is from stuff that's somewhat permanent, like pottery. If their shoes and clothing didn't age, their pottery might not have aged or broken. There'll be no archaeological evidence that would exist from broken pottery, which is one of the big things they look for, because pottery just lasts on and on. But wooden things will decay away, and you find pieces of wood out in the desert, and the better ones will pick it up and use it for cooking. So it'll be gone. And they'll use it for firewood for cooking. And anything that's on the surface is going to be picked up. Bones, scavengers will eat the bones. Mice, for example, rats, will eat the bones of an animal that's not covered up with dirt. If they can get to it, they'll eat the bones. And they'll eat those bones for the minerals in it. So they'll be gone. So there might not be any archaeological evidence. There might be very slim amounts. But they've looked in the wrong place, first of all. They've reasoned wrong with the fallacy of denying the antecedent. So the argument doesn't prove anything. They've looked in the wrong place, second problem. And number three, there probably wasn't much archaeological evidence left. Any questions or comments? So we know their argument's flawed because it contains a logical fallacy to begin with. So I can just throw the argument away, but I've given you plausible answers to the arguments in the first place. They looked in the wrong place, and there probably shouldn't be much archaeological evidence to begin with. All right. Again, they would deny that miracles occur because they're atheists, that these clothing didn't wear out and so forth. Either atheist, skeptic is unaware how to reason properly, that is to make valid logical arguments. A valid argument is one that's properly constructed. An argument that denies the antecedent is invalid. If it's invalid, not properly constructed, it's automatically unsound. Either he doesn't know how to reason, or he's dishonest and intensely making unsound arguments to deceive people. Now then, the question is, if he's unaware how to reason properly, he's unqualified to speak on the matter. He's not qualified. If he's dishonest, he's unworthy to be speaking on the matter. Either way, he shouldn't be speaking. He doesn't have the right to speak up until he learns how to reason right and to be honest. Any questions? But these people will fool our young people because our young people haven't been taught how to reason. If Christian X can explain, here's another argument. If Christian X can explain an aspect A about the flood, then aspect A has an explanation. Well, that's certainly true. So if you as a Christian can explain some question about the flood, then there's an explanation. That's certainly true. But maybe you can't explain something, all right? The fact that you can't explain it, look at the form of the argument. What's your antecedent? Christian X can explain aspect A of the flood. And what have they done? They've denied the antecedent. He cannot explain it. So what's wrong with the argument? Somebody tell me what's wrong with it. You tell me. I'm tired of talking. Somebody in the class, what's wrong with it?
If you can't explain it, it doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen.
That's right, because it denies the antecedent, doesn't it, logically? It's a logical fallacy, see? So it's a fallacy of denying the antecedent. The argument didn't prove anything. And our young people need to understand this before they go off to colleges, because they're going to be hit with this foolishness. These kind of arguments are going to be made by professors that don't know how to reason. Either that or they're dishonest. Either way, they shouldn't be making the arguments. Okay? Let me summarize this, and this lesson will be yours. We've gone a little bit shorter than we normally go, but we would have gone about 30 minutes here. Some of the arguments of skeptics and atheists are logically invalid. They're improperly constructed. And if they're improperly constructed, they just don't prove anything. Some of the arguments of skeptics contain the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. So they'll deny the antecedent. And we've seen the flaws in those. I think it's sophomoric. It's a sophomoric mistake that one who has a good logic course could easily recognize. And it shows when the fellows make those arguments, it shows that they really don't know how to reason. I sat in the class, doctoral level philosophy of education class. There were about 60 people in the class. And I sat there, and I've had several courses in logic. But what I did is I sat there and I asked, whenever we were talking about philosophy of education, there's three basic things you learn in philosophy: reality, truth, and value. Those are your three English words. What is real? What is truth, and how do you know it? What is value? What is good, evil, and so forth? Those are three basic questions asked. They're perfect good questions to ask. The Bible answers all of them. Real is physical things are real and spirits are real. Atheist says there's no such thing as spirit, only physical, material things, materialism. What is truth? How do you know truth? Most of the United States educational system says the only way you know truth is by science. We've already shown that science is always tentative, so you don't know anything for certain then. So you become basically an agnostic. And then a value, how do you determine good and evil? We've already shown that the atheist admits science can't determine what's good and evil. So we don't have any system for determining what's good and evil. So whatever you like is good or evil. If you don't like it, it's evil. If you like it, it's good. And each individual becomes a law unto himself. Now, what I'm saying here is we have this problem. And we get off, and I was in this class now. Let's go back to it. And we had to write a paper on it, and I've written a pretty lengthy treatise on it, on these three principles: what is good, what is real, reality, truth, and value, all three of those. In this class, I asked the whole class, there were about 60 people in the class. I asked them, I raised my hand and said, how many people in this class have had a course in logic? Now, this is people who are getting their PhD, okay? And there was nobody in the class that raised his hand, not one single person. And you say, well, that's just the university where you've attended. No, I've attended about 12 different universities, and I've asked the same question several places. And you find out nobody takes logic. PhD, that's the highest level. That's called a terminal degree. And these people didn't have a course in logic. Now, James, you have a master's, is that right? James, are you there?
Yeah, yes, sir.
Do you have a master's degree?
Yes, I do.
Have you had a course in logic?
Yes, sir, because I've got degrees in physics and math as well.
Okay, so mathematics gets some logic in it. And if you take the right mathematics classes, you'll get logic, okay? All right, so, but your experience, most people that have degrees don't have logic courses, do they?
That's correct.
Yeah, that is correct. It's not taught. So people don't know how to reason. We need to teach our young people how to reason. And I don't know. I think maybe I probably need to put a logic course on the internet here and record it. But I'm just saying, I'm convinced every major principle of logic is found in the Bible. I've been studying this, and I've concluded that they're all there, your major principles. I believe I can show most of them already. And I want to study through the Bible and come up with, maybe put this in the book. But we don't reason right. And our young people are not, they don't have any protection. They don't know how to fend off these attacks by the atheist. So I think it's critical. I really believe in this. Are there questions or comments? I'm about through with the class. All right. No questions or comments. Okay. We're going to get out of the material now. And let me do this. Stop the recording.